The tank stopped in the middle of the testing ground, its four tracks biting into the frozen earth, while the enormous hull settled beneath a sky that seemed almost too empty. It looked less like a conventional armored vehicle than something designed to survive the end of the world. Low, wide, heavy, strange. Its turret sat like a steel dome above a body shaped around one terrifying assumption. The next major war might not be fought like the last one. Across the Soviet Union, military planners were preparing for a battlefield where nuclear weapons could erase entire formations in minutes, where roads could disappear beneath craters, where forests could become radioactive wastelands, and where a tank might have to cross terrain that ordinary vehicles could no longer cross at all. And standing on that frozen range was one of the most extraordinary machines ever built for that nightmare. It was called Object 279. Only one complete prototype survives today. It never entered mass production. It never fought a battle. Yet the Soviet Union built it for a war that its commanders believed could come at any moment. The question was not simply whether a tank could survive enemy fire. The question was whether a tank could keep moving after the battlefield itself had been broken apart. In the years after Stalin's death, the Soviet Union was changing rapidly. The armies of Europe were changing with it. The Second World War had demonstrated the power of massed armor, but the emergence of tactical nuclear weapons threatened to make the familiar battlefield almost unrecognizable. A single nuclear strike could destroy bridges, flatten buildings, create enormous craters, and contaminate the ground. The traditional advantages of roads and prepared routes could disappear. A tank that depended on conventional terrain might become trapped. A tank that was too tall could become an easy target. A tank that was too heavy could collapse bridges or sink into damaged ground. And a tank that could not survive the blast effects of a nuclear detonation might never reach the enemy at all. Soviet designers therefore began thinking about a different kind of armored vehicle. It would need heavy protection, tremendous mobility, and enough stability to cross terrain that ordinary tanks could not. But there was a problem. Every advantage came with a cost. More armor meant more weight. More weight meant worse mobility. More power meant more mechanical complexity. And the heavier the vehicle became, the harder it was to transport and maintain. Soviet engineers had spent decades learning how to solve impossible engineering problems under pressure. Now they were being asked to build a tank for a battlefield where the impossible had become the baseline. One of the most ambitious efforts emerged from the Kirov plant in Leningrad. The project was associated with designer Nikolai Dukov, and later with Lev Troyanov, engineers working within a Soviet armored vehicle industry that had already produced some of the most famous tanks of the 20th century. The machine that emerged from their work was unlike anything the Red Army had previously fielded. Its designation was Object 279. The number sounded bureaucratic. The machine itself was anything but ordinary. The first thing that made Object 279 extraordinary was its shape. Instead of the familiar box-like hull found on many tanks, its body was formed around a distinctive elliptical, almost flattened shell. The hull was heavily armored, but the geometry was carefully designed to resist both conventional projectiles and the pressure effects associated with nuclear explosions. The sloping surfaces reduced vulnerable flat areas. The rounded form also helped the vehicle deal with shockwaves. It was an attempt to solve a problem that went beyond armor thickness. A tank could not simply carry more steel forever. Protection had to come from geometry. The designers were effectively trying to make the hull behave like a shield against forces coming from every direction. But the hull was only part of the answer. Beneath it was the feature that made Object 279 truly bizarre: 4 separate tracks. Conventional tanks generally used 2 continuous tracks, one on each side. Object 279 used 4. The tracks were arranged in pairs, with 2 running on each side of the vehicle. The result was a huge contact area with the ground. Instead of concentrating the vehicle's weight over 2 narrow tracks, the 4-track system spread that weight across a much larger footprint. On paper, this offered a major advantage. If the battlefield was covered with soft soil, mud, snow, craters, or debris, The tank would have a better chance of staying on the surface instead of sinking into it. The same principle that allows snowshoes to keep a person from sinking into deep snow was being applied to a tank weighing well over 50 tons. But the Soviet engineers did not stop there. The suspension was designed to give the vehicle an unusually low ground pressure and remarkable stability. The tracks were integrated into a complicated suspension arrangement, creating a machine that could potentially crawl across terrain that would stop conventional tanks. It was an astonishing solution to the problem of mobility after nuclear devastation. Yet the four-track system created another question. How do you drive four tracks reliably on a battlefield? The answer required a sophisticated mechanical layout and a powerful engine. Object 279 was equipped with a large diesel engine producing roughly 1,000 horsepower. That enormous power plant was necessary because the vehicle was enormous and heavily protected. But the tank was not simply a giant engine wrapped in armor. It was a carefully balanced attempt to combine firepower, protection, and mobility in a package that pushed Soviet engineering to its limits. Its main weapon was a 130mm M65 gun. That was a massive weapon for a tank. The gun was intended to give Object 279 enough firepower to destroy heavily armored enemy vehicles at long distances. During the 1950s, the Soviet Union expected the possibility of facing increasingly powerful Western tanks. NATO armor was evolving. American and British designers were developing new vehicles, improved ammunition, and better fire control systems. Soviet planners did not want to fall behind. The M65 gave Object 279 the kind of destructive capability expected from a heavy breakthrough tank. But firepower created another engineering problem: ammunition. A 130mm round is enormous. The larger the projectile, the more difficult it becomes to carry large quantities inside a tank. Every shell takes up space that could otherwise be used for fuel, equipment, or crew protection. Object 279 therefore became a study in compromise. It had tremendous firepower, but ammunition capacity was limited. It had tremendous armor, but armor added weight. It had 4 tracks for mobility, but 4 tracks increased mechanical complexity. Every solution created another problem. That was the central paradox of Object 279. It was being designed for a war in which there might be no room for weakness. Yet every engineering decision created a new vulnerability. Inside the turret sat a crew of 4: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. The driver occupied the hull, while the other crewmen worked inside the heavily protected turret. Their world would have been one of steel, optics, hydraulic mechanisms, ammunition, and the constant vibration of a massive diesel engine. But the most important protection was not necessarily the armor against shells. Soviet designers were deeply concerned about the effects of nuclear weapons. A nuclear explosion produces heat, radiation, blast pressure, and electromagnetic effects. For armored crews, the immediate danger was the blast and radiation environment. A tank could provide some protection simply by surrounding its crew with thick armor. But the Soviets also considered sealing the vehicle and providing a system that could protect the crew from contaminated air. Object 279 was therefore equipped with protection against nuclear, biological, and chemical threats. The idea was simple in principle. The tank had to become a mobile shelter. The crew could close the vehicle, filter the outside air, and continue operating in a contaminated environment. That concept would become increasingly important during the Cold War. Tanks were not just weapons anymore. They were potential life support systems for soldiers moving through a battlefield poisoned by nuclear or chemical weapons. But there was another reason Object 279 needed unusual protection. Soviet military planners believed a nuclear battlefield might destroy conventional formations without necessarily destroying every armored vehicle. A tank that survived the initial strike could emerge into a landscape where the roads were gone and ordinary movement was impossible. Buildings might be collapsed, forests might be shattered, craters might cover the ground, bridges could disappear. The battlefield would become a maze of obstacles. The 4 tracks of Object 279 were designed for precisely this nightmare. Its enormous ground contact area allowed it to cross difficult terrain with less risk of becoming trapped. Its low silhouette made it harder to detect. Its heavily armored hull could resist severe punishment, and its suspension gave it a degree of stability unusual for such a massive machine. But if the tank was so extraordinary, why did the Soviet Union never build it? To understand that, we have to look at what was happening around it. In the 1950s, Soviet tank development was moving in a new direction. Heavy tanks had dominated thinking during the Second World War and its immediate aftermath. Vehicles, such as the IS series, represented the idea that a tank could survive by carrying enormous armor and an enormous gun. But technology was changing. Engines were improving. Main battle tanks were becoming more powerful. Improved ammunition meant that armor could not simply become thicker indefinitely. Mobility was becoming increasingly important, and nuclear weapons were changing the strategic environment. The Soviet Army began moving toward a concept that would eventually make the distinction between medium and heavy tanks less important. Instead of maintaining separate classes of tanks for different missions, the military could use a powerful main battle tank capable of performing many roles. Object 279 represented the old heavy tank philosophy at its most extreme. It was a specialized machine built to perform a very specific mission. But the Soviet Army increasingly wanted something more flexible. Another problem was cost. A machine this complicated was not simply expensive to manufacture. It would be expensive to maintain. 4 tracks meant more components. More components meant more potential failures. More weight meant greater demands on transportation and logistics. Every tank army depends on an enormous network of fuel trucks, spare parts, mechanics, recovery vehicles, bridges, rail cars, and transporters. A tank that is spectacular on a proving ground can become a nightmare when multiplied into thousands of vehicles. The Soviet military needed weapons that could be produced in large numbers and kept running under brutal field conditions. Object 279 was too specialized for that future. Yet before the project died, it had to prove itself. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting. The prototype was taken to testing grounds where Soviet engineers could push the machine through mud, rough terrain, slopes, obstacles, and other conditions designed to expose weaknesses. The tank's unusual track arrangement immediately became the center of attention. It could move across soft ground with impressive stability. The broad tracks distributed its enormous weight. The vehicle could negotiate terrain that would challenge ordinary tanks. But the same system that made it remarkable also made it complicated. The suspension and track mechanisms required careful engineering. Maintaining 4 tracks was obviously more demanding than maintaining 2. The tank's sheer weight remained a concern, and there was another limitation that the designers could not easily engineer away. The vehicle's huge mass restricted its strategic mobility. Getting a tank from one battlefield to another is not as simple as driving it there. Tanks are transported by rail, road, ships, and heavy equipment carriers. Bridges have weight limits. Roads have load limits. A vehicle weighing well over 50 tons can create logistical problems before it ever reaches combat. The Soviet Union had vast territory, but that did not mean every route could carry a machine like Object 279. The more the engineers tested the tank, the clearer the contradiction became. It was exceptionally capable in the kind of terrain it had been designed to cross. But the very features that made it capable also made it difficult to use on a massive scale. And then there was the battlefield itself. Nuclear weapons were not making heavy tanks more important in every situation. In some ways, they were making the opposite argument. If nuclear weapons could destroy entire concentrations of armor, then concentrating enormous resources into a small number of extremely expensive tanks might be less attractive. The Soviet Army could instead rely on more numerous, versatile tanks supported by artillery, infantry, aircraft, and tactical nuclear weapons of its own. The age of the giant armored breakthrough machine was beginning to fade. Object 279 was not alone in this transition. Other heavy tank projects were being reconsidered. Soviet leadership was increasingly interested in main battle tanks that could combine the mobility of medium tanks with the firepower and protection of heavy tanks. The T-10 remained in service for a time, but even that final Soviet heavy tank would eventually disappear as the main battle tank concept became dominant. Object 279 therefore arrived at precisely the wrong moment. It may have been an answer to a real problem, but the military philosophy surrounding that problem was changing faster than the tank itself. The machine was also influenced by a fascinating Cold War assumption that the battlefield could become so physically damaged that traditional concepts of mobility would fail. This was not science fiction. Soviet planners had witnessed the destruction of Europe during the Second World War. They knew what artillery could do. They knew what bombing could do. They now had to imagine what nuclear weapons could do on top of that. A nuclear battlefield might contain enormous craters and destroyed infrastructure, but it could also contain radiation that forced troops into sealed vehicles. Object 279 was effectively designed as an armored survivor. It was not intended to be elegant. It was intended to keep moving when everything around it had stopped. That is why its silhouette matters. The tank's low, rounded hull was not an aesthetic decision. It was the physical expression of Soviet fears about the future. The engineers were not designing for the battlefield of 1944. They were designing for a battlefield where the landscape itself had become hostile. And then the Americans entered the story, not through a direct confrontation, but through intelligence. During the Cold War, American intelligence agencies watched Soviet military developments with enormous interest. Satellite reconnaissance would eventually transform this process. But in the 1950s, the United States relied on a mixture of reconnaissance aircraft, human intelligence, captured information, photographs, and analysis of Soviet military activity. Any unusual armored vehicle could attract attention. A strange tank with 4 tracks was exactly the kind of machine that analysts would want to understand. Western observers were accustomed to Soviet tanks following recognizable design patterns. The appearance of a radically different heavy tank suggested that Soviet engineers might be experimenting with a new concept. But there was an important difference between seeing a prototype and understanding its purpose. Intelligence analysts could identify the dimensions of a vehicle, estimate its armor, recognize its gun, and study its mobility. But the reason behind its design required interpretation. Was Object 279 intended for breakthrough operations? Was it designed to defeat NATO heavy tanks? Was it a nuclear battlefield machine? Or was it simply an experimental dead end? The answer was all of these things to some degree. The tank embodied multiple Soviet concerns at once. But its most distinctive features strongly pointed toward a vehicle designed to operate under extraordinary battlefield conditions. The Western response did not take the form of copying Object 279. There was no American 4-track tank built as a direct equivalent. Instead, the United States and NATO continued pursuing their own solutions to the changing armored battlefield. The Americans had their own heavy tanks, including the M103, but the trend was already moving toward more mobile and versatile platforms. The M60 Patton and other main battle tanks represented the direction Western armored warfare was taking. The contest was no longer simply about building the heaviest possible tank. It was about balancing protection, mobility, firepower, reliability, logistics, and cost. Object 279 had pushed one part of that equation to an extreme. The Soviet Army ultimately decided that extreme was not worth the price. The project was halted. The tank would not become a production vehicle. Its 4-track system would not become standard Soviet practice. Its massive 130mm gun would not define the next generation of Soviet armored warfare. The nuclear battlefield tank had reached the end of its road without ever firing a shot in anger. But the story did not end there. The prototype survived. And because it survived, the tank became something rare in military history, a physical snapshot of a future that never happened. Today, the surviving Object 279 allows us to see exactly what Soviet engineers thought the next war might look like. Its hull still carries the logic of the Cold War. Its tracks still show the obsession with mobility over broken ground. Its enormous gun still represents the belief that armored combat could demand extraordinary firepower. Its sealed crew compartment still reflects the terrifying possibility that soldiers might have to fight inside a nuclear-contaminated environment. And its strange shape reveals something even deeper. Military technology is often a conversation between fear and engineering. A nation imagines a threat. Engineers are given a requirement. They translate that fear into steel, engines, armor, guns, and machines. Sometimes they produce a weapon that changes history. Sometimes they produce a machine that becomes obsolete before it can enter service. Object 279 belongs to the second category, but calling it a failure would miss the point. It was not defeated by an enemy tank. It was defeated by a change in military thinking. The battlefield it was designed for never arrived in the form its creators expected. The Soviet Union never fought the massive nuclear ground war that planners feared. NATO and Warsaw Pact forces never met in the Central European armored confrontation that had haunted Cold War strategists. And so Object 279 remained trapped in the world of possibility. Its greatest enemy was not the M60, not a NATO missile, not an American heavy tank. Its greatest enemy was the future itself. The Soviet army realized that a tank designed specifically for the apocalypse might not be the best tank for everything that happened before the apocalypse. That realization was decisive. A military cannot equip itself entirely for one nightmare scenario. It must prepare for many possibilities. The machine must be transported, repaired, fueled, manufactured, crewed, supported, recovered when damaged, integrated into formations, and above all, it must justify its cost. Object 279 struggled with nearly every one of those demands. Its engineering was brilliant, but brilliance is not the same as practicality. Its 4 tracks solved one problem while creating several others. Its heavy armor increased survivability while increasing weight. Its enormous gun increased destructive power while reducing ammunition capacity and adding further logistical demands. Its nuclear protection increased crew survivability while adding complexity. It was a tank where every answer generated another question. That is precisely why it remains fascinating. The most important military inventions are not always the ones that enter production. Sometimes the most revealing machines are the ones that almost became weapons of war. They show us what their designers feared. They show us what generals believed. They show us which technological paths were explored and then abandoned. Object 279 was one of those paths. Its story also demonstrates why the Cold War was so dangerous. Both superpowers were planning for conflicts that they desperately hoped would never happen. They built aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons across continents. They built missiles capable of destroying cities. They built submarines that could hide beneath oceans for months. And they built tanks like Object 279 to fight through the ruins left behind after nuclear weapons had transformed the battlefield. The contradiction was enormous. These machines were created to make nuclear war survivable. But their existence also reflected how seriously governments prepared for the possibility of nuclear war. Object 279 was not designed because Soviet leaders believed nuclear war would be harmless. It was designed because they believed that if nuclear war came, armored forces might still have to fight. The tank therefore represented a grim calculation. If civilization's infrastructure was destroyed, the army would still need to move. And if the roads disappeared, the tank would need to make its own path. In that sense, the 4 tracks were more than an engineering novelty. They were a statement. The designers were saying that the battlefield could become so broken that conventional assumptions about mobility would no longer apply. But history eventually proved that the Soviet military needed a different kind of answer. The T-64, T-72, T-80, and later generations of Soviet and Russian main battle tanks followed a more practical path. They retained heavy firepower and strong protection, but placed greater emphasis on mass production, mobility, standardization, and operational flexibility. These tanks could perform across a wide range of missions without requiring the extraordinary complexity of Object 279. The lesson was not that heavy armor was useless. The lesson was that a weapon must fit the entire military system around it. A tank does not fight alone. It fights as part of a formation. It depends on fuel, ammunition, mechanics, bridges, railways, transporters, command networks, reconnaissance, infantry, artillery, aircraft. The best tank is therefore not necessarily the one with the most armor or the largest gun. It is the one that can function inside the machine of war. Object 279 was an extraordinary machine, but it was too extraordinary, and that was its downfall. The final irony is that the tank built for a nuclear battlefield never had to face one. Its 4 tracks never crossed a radioactive crater. Its massive gun never engaged a NATO armored column. Its nuclear protection system never had to save a crew from a battlefield contaminated by an atomic explosion. The machine remained a prototype. Yet decades later, its appearance still feels almost futuristic. Visitors looking at the surviving vehicle can immediately see why it attracted so much attention. It seems to belong to another timeline, a timeline in which the Cold War became hot, a timeline in which tactical nuclear weapons shattered Europe and armored formations continued fighting through the wreckage. A timeline in which the strange 4-track Soviet monster might have been exactly the right machine. But that timeline never came, and perhaps that is the most important thing about Object 279. It reminds us that military history is filled with weapons designed for wars that never happened. Some are forgotten. Others survive because they capture the imagination. Object 279 did both. It was a dead end technologically, but a masterpiece of historical evidence. It tells us what Soviet engineers believed was possible. It tells us what Soviet commanders feared. It tells us how deeply nuclear warfare had penetrated military planning. And it shows how quickly technology can become obsolete when the assumptions behind it change. When the tank first emerged from the Soviet design bureaus, its creators were looking toward a future of nuclear shockwaves, devastated terrain, and armored formations pushing through the ruins of Europe. They tried to build a machine that could survive that world. They succeeded in creating something extraordinary, but they could not control the future for which they had built it. That future moved in another direction. The Cold War continued, but the battlefield never became the nuclear wasteland Object 279 had been designed to cross. The Soviet Union instead embraced tanks that were simpler, more numerous, easier to support, and capable of fighting across a wider range of conditions. Object 279 became a prototype, then an artifact, then a symbol, and the machine that once represented the terrifying possibility of nuclear ground warfare became, ironically, a monument to a war that never came. There is something haunting about that. A tank sits motionless in a museum while the world around it has changed completely. Its tracks no longer churn through mud. Its engine no longer shakes the hull. Its gun no longer points toward an imagined enemy. The danger it was built to confront has passed into history. But the questions that created it remain. How do you design for a future nobody can predict? How much complexity is worth paying for? How far should an army go to prepare for the worst possible war? And when the future changes, can even the most brilliant machine become irrelevant? Object 279 never conquered a battlefield. It never led an armored breakthrough. It never became the feared spearhead of a Soviet offensive. Its achievement was something stranger. It captured, in steel, the fears of an entire era. A low, rounded hull, 4 tracks, a giant gun, a sealed fighting compartment. More than 50 tons of armor and machinery built around one desperate idea, that after the nuclear explosion, something might still have to move forward. That was the world Object 279 was built for, and perhaps the greatest tragedy of the machine was also its greatest success. The war it was designed to survive never happened. The tank remained unfinished history, frozen in place while the Cold War passed around it. But standing before that strange Soviet vehicle today, it is possible to understand what its designers were really building. They were not simply building a tank. They were building an answer to the most frightening question of their age. If the world ended in fire, could an armored army still keep moving? Object 279 was their answer. History simply never gave it the chance to prove whether they were right.